Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the Boujee Booktuber tag. This tag was created by Olive from A Book Olive, and I was tagged by Graham Quigley, and I will link to both of their channels below. Despite the name, this tag is not a celebration of nouveau riche style. It is just about book buying habits, which is kind of interesting for me because more than 90% of the books that I read come from the library, although I do buy books, especially as gifts. So, question number 1 is, what is your average monthly budget for books? I don't set budget for books, but if I had to average it month over month, it's probably around $50 per month, and that's 50 Canadian dollars, which I think at the current rates is about 38 US dollars, 34 euro, and probably around 32 pounds. I don't know what's happening with the pound lately, so that might be off slightly, but that's about what that is. Question number 2 is, what is the most you've ever spent at a bookstore? Both of my examples are from when I was living in Calgary about 15 years ago, so that was kind of my moment of big capitalism, I guess. There used to be a McNally Robinson, which is an independent bookstore in Canada. Their only physical location now is in Saskatchewan, but they used to have one on Stephen Avenue in Calgary. And it was basically the next street over from where I was working, and a coworker and I went in there once and basically encouraged each other to do a lot of shopping and bought an extraordinary number of books. I don't remember exactly what the amount was on that, so my other example is going to also be from Calgary. My local comic book shop when I was living there was Kamikaze on McLeod, which I think is still there. And they used to have a sale, I think twice a year, where if you spent over $300, you would get half off. So I would go in and I would buy a lot of the album type books because these tend to be between $20 and $30 Canadian. In general, I would rather pay $20 for a book like this than the floppy, like the American style comic collections, but still it is expensive, so half off always made me happy. So I obviously was buying, you know, 300 plus worth of books for $150 plus. So I think those are probably the times that I spent the most. Question number 3 is, are you willing to pay full price for a brand new release, or will you wait until there's a sale? Because most of the books that I read come from the library, in general, if I'm buying a new book, I usually get it out of the library first and buy it afterwards if it's something that I want to keep and reread. So because of that, I rarely buy books on release. So there isn't necessarily a sale, but generally prices will either go down or you'll find them on the secondary market or on the remaindered market. Now that said, for gifts, I do buy books new. Last year for her birthday, I bought my sister these 2 books new, Washington Black. I think the cover price on this was $34 and the cover price on this one is $40. Again, those are the Canadian prices. My sister is quite a minimalist, so normally she sells her books at a used bookstore after she has them. She does buy herself new books though, because that cycle kind of goes around. But in this case, she gave them back to me so that I could read them. So that's why I have these. So yeah, so I'm not averse to buying new books, but because I prefer to read books before I buy them, I tend to buy them later in the publicity cycle when I'm buying for myself. With the exception of comic books, which I do sometimes pre-order just because of the way the comics market works, which I don't like. I kind of feel like that's supporting an element of that specific subset of publishing that I don't think is good for the industry. But I don't think that's really what this question is trying to get at. So, question number 4 is, would you rather buy one new book or several less expensive used copies? I think financially it just makes more sense to get multiple copies if you can get multiple copies for the multiple books for the price of one. In reality, I don't think it always works that way. I recently bought an out-of-print book for my mother, something that's been out of print since the 80s, and this book cost like 35 euro and then 16 euro shipping on top of it, so that was not cheap. I could have bought a couple of new books for the same price as that used book, so the math doesn't always work that way. But yeah, again, when I'm buying for myself, I would in general prefer to buy several used books versus one new one. And I've seen some people complain that because you're only supporting the local shop, you're not supporting the publishing industry, but I would argue with that, because if you're somebody like my sister who does buy new books and then sells them to used bookstores, those used bookstores need to have a market to buy those books in order for those people to sell them. And that's a common thing, people who buy new and then sell. And I know for a lot of people who do buy them new with the assumption that they can resell them, if you took away the resale market, they would buy fewer books new or would wait for sales more. So you are indirectly still supporting that primary sale. So anyway, commentary. I just saw I think it was Supposedly Fun who commented on that in his video, which I'll link to below as well, because he did have a rant that I don't completely agree with, but he had some good points in there. Question number 5 is, what do you think is a reasonable price for a new hardback book, a paperback, or an ebook? I think ebooks overall are overpriced, not because they don't have as many costs associated with them, because obviously you're still paying the publisher and the editor and the author, although obviously you're not killing as many trees, but just because of the whole digital rights management issue and you're not actually buying them. So I only buy ebooks at a discount. I wouldn't say never, because when I was living in Houston, I would occasionally buy a new release book that was released in Canada but not in the US yet, because my iTunes and Amazon accounts were both associated with Canadian accounts, so I could buy them earlier. So I would occasionally pay the higher prices for that. But in general, I think it's ridiculous to pay the prices that they are asked for when you're not actually buying the file, you're borrowing the file. As for the physical books themselves, I think it depends on things like paper quality, obviously the size of the press, because the number of things that are ordered in massive numbers are going to come at a discount on the production side, so that gets reflected in the consumer price, so it varies depending on a lot. I do think it's kind of shocking how much like mass market paperbacks have gone up. Like this is from the 60s and was 75 cents US, and I think now, I do like mass market paperbacks, but ones of equal size tend to be around $10 Canadian, with exceptions. I mean, I know some of the presses like in the UK and in France will put out these smaller things, like this is supposed to be £1, this is supposed to be €2. I've mentioned this before, these are like $6 in Canada, which I think is ridiculous. These tend to be between $3.50 and $4, which I think is more reasonable. But yeah, I don't know. I like mass market paperbacks, but I think when you compare the prices country to country, it's not always what you would want. I think that's especially true when the currencies are fluctuating. And this is going to be another comics example, but there was a point around 2013 where the Canadian and US dollars were at parity, which they are not now, but I mean, as was given when I was talking about the budget question. But at that time they were, but the price differential was still marked on the books, and I think that's objectionable. Question number 6 is a signed book worth more to you? How about a first edition? A signed book is not generally worth more to me. I have occasionally had art signed by the artists, and again, this is more comics related, but yeah, I'm not big on getting things signed by authors. As for first editions, I'm also not a collector of those, but when I have volunteered at libraries, and especially when I was volunteering with the Friends of the Houston Public Library, because the Houston Public Library doesn't get city tax dollars, it's funded in a really different way compared to most public library systems that I've seen, especially in a city of that size. Anyway, when somebody donated a box of books, it would be very exciting if there was a first edition in there, because you could sell that at a high premium, and that is value that comes back into the library. I do put value on that, not necessarily for myself, but in terms of if you're donating things to your public library, there you go, they can make money off that. Question number 7 is, what is your most valuable book, sentimental or actual value? The most expensive book that I have bought recently is I bought this enormous slip-cased collection of the Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch run on The Authority, which I love. Question number 8 is, will you pay more for a cover or edition that you like better? Yes, that's obviously yes. I own this original run in the floppies. I also own the original trade paperback. I still bought this because how can you not, like, look at this? That's just beautiful. So yes, I think that's worthwhile. If you've seen, I don't think Book Cravings has made a video in a long time, but her collection of the Folio Society books are just amazing. I'm going to link to her channel below, because if you haven't looked at those, and I mean, and she's in Brazil, so the shipping costs that she must pay for those is extraordinary, but her books just look astonishing. And I think that obviously that doesn't have value to everybody, and as I said, when it comes to books that are text, I'm happy with mass market paperbacks, but if you do want your books to look like pieces of art, I mean, they're extraordinary. Question number 9 is, what physical characteristics does a good quality book have? I think having spines that are sewn rather than glue is good. I think having glossy pages, especially if it's something that's illustrated, is something that's really valuable. I think having the kind of cover that isn't going to disintegrate in humidity has a lot of value to it. So all things like that. And again, when I'm buying a little mass market paperback, I don't necessarily care about those elements because you're just buying it for the text and nothing else. But I do think if you are paying more for books, which, as I said, I'm not averse to, I think it has to have those extra qualities. I do think it's ridiculous when you see a hardcover that's $45 and the spine is glued and it's going to come apart if the humidity level changes. So, question number 10 is, if you won the lottery, what bookish things would you do with the money? Depends what lottery I won. If you only won, $250,000, I don't know that you'd do anything bookish with that. If you won that Powerball lottery that they had, what was it, 2 years ago, where it was like just under $1 billion US, then, yeah, you'd definitely, given what I found out about how like the Houston Public Library is funded, I would find other library systems that aren't funded in the normal way, and I think you'd want to donate to them, and also to school systems that aren't properly funded in terms of books. And I think there are a lot of literacy organizations that you could donate to as well. And as for things I would buy for myself, I would buy a few extra copies of one of my favorite books that's out of print and really expensive on the secondary market. And I would buy extra copies of it just so that, if my one copy is damaged, because my original copy was stolen by a friend of mine who borrowed it and we're not in contact anymore, so that's awkward. But I think the bonus question is to show a picture of your ideal home library. And I don't know that I have an ideal home library. I feel like if I lived in a cabin in the woods, I would probably want something elaborate, so maybe I'll insert a picture of something elaborate here. But I feel like if you're in a city with a decent public library system, there's no need to have a huge home library. But that's just me. And I do enjoy having stacks of mass market paperbacks, despite the fact that I have all this stuff that isn't necessarily. Or who I could tag. I think just because I think it would be funny to tag. I don't think she does tag videos now, but I think it would be funny to tag Courtney Pickles just because of the title, because she does all of those working class book collector themed videos, and I think she should do a tag with Boujee in the title just because it's funny. Is that terrible? That might be terrible. Anyway, as always, if you haven't done this tag and you would like to do this tag, please consider yourself tagged. That's it for now. Ciao.